The millionaire CEO sat through a charity concert out of politeness, until two little girls stepped on stage and sang a song that shattered his entire past. The room buzzed with soft music, clinking glasses, and the polite laughter of donors who had come to show face more than heart. Adam Rivers stood near the back of the grand ballroom, a glass of untouched champagne in his hand, already calculating how soon he could leave without being noticed. These charity events were rarely about the cause and more about appearances. He had donated generously, more than anyone else in the room, but he didn't care for praise or mingling. His light brown hair was neatly styled, his tailored black suit flawless, and his deep brown eyes scanned the room with mild detachment. He was here out of obligation, nothing more. He was just about to turn away from the stage and make a quiet exit when the host stepped up to the microphone and announced a special performance. Two young sisters were going to sing, the host said, in support of children's medical needs. It barely registered for Adam, just background noise. But when the spotlight hit the stage and two little girls walked out hand in hand, something inside him jolted. They couldn't have been more than 6 years old. They wore matching white dresses, and their long brown hair curled softly around their faces. Their eyes, warm, wide, and so painfully familiar, seemed to pierce right through him. As the music began and they started to sing, Adam remained still, completely unaware of the rest of the room. The girls had a natural harmony, their voices clear and sweet, innocent but strong. The crowd around him softened, and some even wiped away tears, but Adam could only focus on one thing. Their faces. The shape of their eyes, the tilt of their chin, the way one of them tapped her foot slightly offbeat, all of it was unmistakably connected to something, or rather someone, in his past. He leaned slightly forward, as if closing the distance between himself and a truth he hadn't yet accepted. And that's when he saw her. Off to the side of the stage, standing alone, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, was a woman with familiar posture and a face he hadn't seen in 6 years. Her hair was longer now, darker, her expression more tired, but he'd recognize her anywhere. Cassie. The woman who had vanished from his life without warning or explanation. The woman who had once meant everything. His mind tried to piece together what he was seeing, but his body was already reacting. His heart pounded. He couldn't breathe. The girls on the stage, singing like little stars, were not just any performers. They were hers. And if his instincts were right, if the echo of his own features in their faces meant anything, they were his too. He didn't wait for applause. As soon as the final note ended and the audience erupted in claps, he turned and walked quickly out of the ballroom, his thoughts racing, his stomach in knots. The past he thought was buried had just walked out onto a stage and looked him straight in the eye. And nothing in his life, no deal, no title, no empire, could have prepared him for that moment. Adam stood alone in the corridor just outside the ballroom, his pulse still racing. He braced his hands on the marble-topped drinks table, trying to ground himself as the realization continued to hit in crashing waves. Those girls hadn't just looked like him, they were him. Reflections of his features in smaller, brighter, more innocent forms. And Cassie. Her presence confirmed everything. He hadn't seen her since the week she left, the same week she ended their relationship without a reason, without a word. No calls, no texts, no closure. One day she had simply vanished from his life, and despite all his influence and connections, she stayed hidden. And now, suddenly, she was here, and she wasn't alone. For a moment he considered leaving. It would be easier. Cleaner. But something in him refused. He had spent his life walking away from complications, turning emotion into logic and pain into silence. But not this time. He couldn't walk away from what he had seen on that stage. He didn't even want to. Without hesitation, he made his way back toward the ballroom doors and waited just outside, hidden in the shadows, until the crowd thinned and the girls disappeared backstage. Minutes later, he saw her emerge, ushering the girls toward the exit with a protective hand on each of their small backs. Cassie was thinner than he remembered, her face more drawn, and she moved with a quiet urgency, the way people do when they've lived too long in survival mode. But she still had that same grace, that quiet strength that had first drawn him to her years ago. As she stepped closer, he saw her freeze the moment their eyes met. The girls didn't notice. They skipped ahead, chatting to each other about cookies and glitter. Cassie didn't speak at first. Her lips parted slightly, as if her breath had been stolen, and her eyes widened in disbelief. Adam walked slowly toward her until there was only a few feet between them. For a moment they just stared at each other, the air between them so thick neither could breathe. "You left," he said, his voice low and controlled, but trembling just beneath the surface. "You disappeared without a word. And now I find you here. With them." He didn't look toward the girls. He couldn't. It would break him. Cassie swallowed hard. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again." Her voice was soft but steady. "I didn't know how to tell you. Are they mine?" The words felt foreign in his mouth, like they belonged to someone else. She looked down. "Yes." The answer didn't shock him. It only deepened the ache in his chest. "Why didn't you tell me, Cassie? Why would you keep them from me?" Her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and guilt. "Because you were building an empire, Adam. You had just closed your biggest acquisition. You were working 20-hour days. You told me there was no room for anything else. I believed you." She paused. "I was scared. I didn't want to be the one who distracted you. Or ruined what you had worked for." Adam shook his head slowly, his voice raw. "You didn't ruin anything. You took everything." Cassie stepped forward, just slightly, her voice quiet but clear. "One of them, Chloe, she's sick. She needs surgery. That's why we were here tonight. To raise enough to help her. I tried everything else." He stared at her in stunned silence. 1,000 emotions raced through him, anger, regret, helplessness. But beneath all of it was something stronger. Determination. "Where are you staying?" he asked. She hesitated. "A friend's place. Not far." "I want to see them," he said. "I want to know them." Cassie nodded slowly. "Okay. But go slow. They don't know anything." He looked toward the door where the girls had disappeared. "Then it's time they do." Cassie led Adam down a quiet residential street that curved away from the glow of the city, the air cool and still. They walked in silence, the sound of their shoes tapping against the pavement the only rhythm between them. Every few steps, Cassie would glance over her shoulder to make sure the girls were still ahead, skipping and laughing, unaware of the tension walking behind them. Adam kept his distance at first, unsure of what he was even allowed to feel, let alone say. His mind was running wild with questions, memories, and emotions that hadn't surfaced in years. Seeing Cassie again was like cracking open a time capsule that had been buried too deep. Seeing the girls, his daughters, was like meeting the future he'd never been told was his. They reached a modest house tucked behind a row of tall hedges. It wasn't fancy, but it looked lived in, cared for. Cassie opened the front door and let the girls rush inside. "Go wash up," she called after them. "We'll have tea before bed." The girls ran off, their giggles trailing down the hallway. The sound was like music and thunder in Adam's ears, sweet and deafening. Cassie stood in the small foyer, waiting for him to come inside. He hesitated at the threshold, as if afraid crossing it would make everything permanent. But he stepped forward. Inside, the house was warm, quiet, and full of traces of the life he had missed. Children's shoes near the door, drawings on the refrigerator, a half-built puzzle on the coffee table. It was all so intimate, so familiar and foreign at once. Cassie offered him tea, but he shook his head. He didn't want to pretend this was normal. "When did you find out Chloe was sick?" he asked, breaking the silence. She leaned against the kitchen doorway. "About a year ago." It started with shortness of breath, fatigue. We saw a cardiologist. It's a congenital defect. Fixable, but expensive. The kind of surgery that needs a specialist and a long recovery. She looked down at her hands. I couldn't afford it. The fundraiser tonight was a last try. He felt something shift in his chest, a slow building pressure that had nowhere to go. Why didn't you call me then? Not about us. Just about her. You knew I'd help. I didn't know that, she said honestly. I didn't know what you'd say after all this time. After everything I didn't say. Adam turned away, walked toward the hallway, his fingers brushing the edge of a framed drawing, 3 stick figures and a rainbow. His name wasn't written anywhere. Of course it wasn't. He wasn't part of this story. Not until now. Do they know about me? He asked. No, Cassie replied, quiet again. They know they have a father, but not who. I didn't lie, I just left out the details. I didn't want to fill their heads with someone who might not come back. Adam clenched his jaw. I'm not going anywhere now. Cassie didn't smile, didn't soften. I want to believe that. Just then, the girls came back into the room, now in pajamas, matching ones with little yellow stars. Chloe climbed up onto the couch with a picture book in hand, while Emma wandered over to Adam without hesitation. You were at our concert, she said matter-of-factly. I saw you looking at us. He lowered himself to her level. Yes. I was there. You both sang beautifully. She looked him over with narrowed eyes, curious, almost suspicious. Are you Mommy's friend? He hesitated. Cassie held her breath behind them. I'm hoping I can be your friend too, he said carefully. Emma considered that. Okay. But you'll have to learn the secret handshake. And Chloe has to like you first. He smiled for real then, something soft and unfamiliar on his face. Deal. Later, after tea and bedtime stories and reluctant goodnights, Adam stood in the hallway outside the girls' bedroom, watching their slow, even breathing. Chloe clutched a stuffed bear, Emma's hand dangled off the bed. He turned to Cassie, who stood beside him, arms folded, tired in a way only mothers are. You raised them well, he said. I did my best, she replied. You shouldn't have had to do it alone. She looked at him, unsure of what to say. I can't change the past, he said. But I want to be part of their future. Whatever that looks like. And for the first time that night, Cassie didn't pull away. She simply nodded. Then start by being here tomorrow. And he knew he would. The next morning came softly, sunlight spilling through the sheer curtains and painting the living room in warm gold. Adam had barely slept, spending most of the night on the small pull-out couch in Cassie's guest room, staring at the ceiling with thoughts that refused to quiet. For the first time in his life, he felt like the outsider in a world he desperately wanted to belong to. When he finally rose, the house was already awake. Laughter floated from the kitchen, along with the smell of pancakes and something sweet, maybe syrup or cinnamon. He followed the sound and found Cassie flipping pancakes with one hand while Emma sat at the table coloring, and Chloe stood beside her mother, watching the pan with serious concentration. It looked effortless, natural, like a life with routines he had never been part of. But the moment Emma saw him, her eyes lit up and she jumped down from her chair. You came back, she shouted, running to hug his legs. Adam bent down, surprised and grateful all at once. Of course I did, he said, smoothing her hair. I said I would. Chloe looked over, quieter, more hesitant. Her eyes lingered on him as if she were trying to figure out where he fit. Cassie handed her the spatula and came to stand next to him. She's slower to trust, she said under her breath. Always has been. Adam nodded. She doesn't have to trust me right away. She just needs to see that I'm not leaving. He helped set the table, and they all sat down to eat. It was awkward at first, Adam still unsure of how to move in this new space, but the girls didn't seem to care. Emma talked non-stop, between bites of pancake, about school, cartoons, and a friend who had a pet lizard. Chloe said less, but Adam noticed how she watched everything, especially him. She was observing, calculating, trying to make sense of who he was and why he was suddenly here. After breakfast, the girls went to get dressed while Cassie washed dishes. Adam dried them silently beside her, both of them aware of the strange rhythm they were beginning to fall into. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but sure. "You're really going to stay?" He nodded. "I am." "For how long?" "As long as they'll let me." "As long as you will." She didn't answer right away. "I'm not used to help. I've been on my own with them for so long, it's hard to let someone in." "I don't want to take anything away from what you've built," he said, placing a clean plate on the counter. "I just want to be part of it." They spent the rest of the day together, a strange kind of test run for something resembling a family. Adam joined the girls in a game of pretend, some combination of princess rescue and space mission, and found himself laughing, truly laughing, in a way that felt foreign and long overdue. When Chloe accidentally bumped into him and he caught her, she didn't pull away. She looked up at him and said quietly, "You don't feel like a stranger anymore." He felt something tighten in his chest at that. He didn't want to be a stranger. Not ever again. That night, after the girls were tucked in, Adam stood in the doorway watching them sleep. Cassie came up beside him, arms folded over her chest. "They've never had anyone else here," she said. "Not really. No one who stayed." He looked at her, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm staying." She looked up at him, not entirely convinced, but not pushing him away either. And for the first time, it didn't feel like he was borrowing someone else's life. It felt like he was beginning his own. The following days settled into a strange, tender rhythm that neither Adam nor Cassie had expected. Each morning, Adam would wake before the girls, sometimes helping Cassie with breakfast, other times simply watching her move through the kitchen with a comfort and grace he hadn't realized he missed. He began to learn small but significant things. Emma liked syrup on everything, Chloe only wore mismatched socks on purpose, and both girls insisted that pancakes tasted better if eaten while sitting on the floor. He didn't question any of it. He simply joined them, one moment at a time, folding himself into the life he had been absent from for far too long. Chloe remained cautious but no longer distant. She would ask him questions, not about the past, but about himself. What was his favorite animal? Did he like rainy days? Could he whistle? Every answer seemed to add a brick to the bridge she was building between them. One afternoon, she brought him one of her drawings, 3 stick figures under a tree, 2 small ones holding hands with a taller one in the middle. "This is us," she said shyly. "If you want it." He didn't say anything for a moment, afraid his voice would break. He simply nodded and said, "I do." Adam also began spending more time with Cassie, though never in a way that pressed or demanded. He respected the boundaries she had drawn, but he sensed they were beginning to shift. They talked late into the evenings after the girls went to sleep, sometimes about the future, sometimes about the years between them that had stretched like a silence neither knew how to fill. Cassie told him how hard it had been, how she had worked nights and skipped meals to make sure the girls had enough, how many times she had looked at her phone and almost called him. He listened without interrupting, letting her share what she had kept locked inside for so long. One evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the girls chase fireflies in the fading light, Cassie turned to him and said, "I never wanted to do it alone, Adam. I was just scared you wouldn't want this. Any of it." He didn't look away. "I didn't know what I wanted back then. I thought success was the only thing that mattered. But it's not. Not even close." Her eyes searched his, full of guarded hope. "You mean that?" "I mean every word," he replied. The next day, Adam took a call from the hospital while the girls played in the yard. The specialist had reviewed Chloe's case and recommended surgery soon. The timing was right, and thanks to Adam's connections and insistence, everything could be scheduled within the week. When he told Cassie, she was silent for a moment, tears filling her eyes. "You really did it," she said. "You saved her." "No," Adam replied, shaking his head. "You did. You fought for her. I'm just finally doing what I should have done from the beginning." They sat with the girls that evening and explained the surgery in gentle, careful words. Chloe nodded bravely, even though Adam could see the fear in her eyes. He took her hand and promised he would be there the entire time. She looked at him for a long moment before saying, "Okay. But only if you bring my bear too." That night, as Cassie tucked the girls into bed, Adam stood just outside their room listening to the lullabies and whispered goodnights. He felt like a stranger and a father all at once, carrying the weight of missed years alongside the hope of new ones. And when Cassie stepped into the hallway and met his gaze, he saw it in her eyes, something changing, something softening. Not forgiveness, not yet. But something real. And for the first time in a long time, Adam felt worthy of the title he had never dared claim, Dad. The morning of the surgery arrived with a gray sky and quiet air, as if the world itself understood the weight of the day. Adam had barely slept the night before, and he could tell Cassie hadn't either. They moved around the kitchen like ghosts, making breakfast no one had the appetite to eat. Chloe sat at the table with her stuffed bear clutched to her chest, her small fingers wrapped tightly around its worn paw. Emma stayed close to her sister, unusually quiet, watching her every move like she might vanish. Cassie tried to smile, offering gentle words of encouragement, but Adam could see the fear hiding behind her calm exterior. He wished he could take it from her, carry it all himself, but all he could do was be there, fully, completely, without distraction. When it was time to leave, he helped Chloe into her little coat, careful to keep his voice steady. She looked up at him with her big brown eyes and whispered, "Will it hurt?" He knelt down beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Maybe a little," he said honestly. "But we're going to be right there when you wake up. And after that, it's going to get better. I promise." The drive to the hospital was quiet, filled only with the soft hum of the engine and the occasional whispered word from the back seat. Cassie held Chloe's hand the whole way. Adam drove with white knuckles, watching the rearview mirror more than the road, checking and rechecking Chloe's expression. Every now and then she caught his eye and gave him a tiny, nervous smile, as if trying to reassure him instead of the other way around. At the hospital, the staff was kind and warm, doing their best to make the sterile environment feel less frightening. Chloe was brave, more than anyone had a right to expect from someone so small. She answered questions calmly, held her bear tightly, and only faltered when the nurse said it was time to say goodbye. Her lower lip trembled, and she turned to Adam and Cassie with wide eyes. "You'll be here when I wake up?" she asked. Adam nodded immediately, taking her hand. "We're not going anywhere." They watched her disappear down the hallway, her bear tucked under her arm, her small form swallowed up by the hospital gown and the large doors. When she was gone, the silence became unbearable. Cassie collapsed into the nearest chair, burying her face in her hands. Adam sat beside her, placing his arm around her shoulders without a word. For the first time since they had reunited, she leaned into him without hesitation. He felt her breath shake, felt her tears soak into his shirt, and held her tighter. Hours passed in a haze of waiting room coffee, brief updates, and unbearable stillness. Adam tried reading emails, scrolling through news, anything to keep his mind from wandering into fear. But nothing helped. Every time the door opened, he jumped, his stomach twisting, his mind bracing for the worst. When the doctor finally walked in, both Adam and Cassie stood at the same time, holding their breath. The surgeon smiled, tired but reassuring. "She did beautifully," he said. "The surgery went well, no complications. She'll be in recovery for a while, but everything looks good." Cassie burst into tears. Adam felt his legs weaken and sat back down, breathing out a relief so deep it made him dizzy. The doctor continued speaking, explaining post-op care, medications, follow-up appointments, but Adam barely heard it. All he could focus on was the fact that she was okay. Later, they were allowed to see her. Chloe looked impossibly small in the hospital bed, her face pale, her breathing slow but steady. Emma stood beside her quietly, holding her sister's hand. Cassie brushed the hair from Chloe's forehead and whispered something Adam couldn't hear. Then Chloe's eyelids fluttered open, and she looked around the room. Her gaze landed on Adam. "You stayed," she said in a hoarse whisper. He stepped forward and smiled. "Of course I did." She gave a weak smile, then added, "Did you bring my bear?" He held it up and placed it gently beside her. "Never let it out of my sight." She nodded, her eyes already closing again, drifting back into sleep with the comfort of knowing she was safe. That night, Adam sat in the hospital chair beside her bed, long after Cassie and Emma had gone home to rest. He watched the monitors blink, listened to the soft beat of her heart, and realized that in the span of just a few days, everything had changed. He was no longer a man defined by boardrooms, deadlines, and corporate conquests. He was a father. And he was never walking away again. Chloe's recovery was slower than anyone had hoped, but it was steady. She spent several days in the hospital, drifting between long naps and quiet moments with books and soft cartoons playing on the television. The nurses adored her, charmed by her quiet strength and sharp wit. Cassie rarely left her side, always hovering with a gentle hand and steady voice, while Adam split his time between work, only what was absolutely necessary, and being in that room, helping in any way he could. He read to Chloe in the mornings, brought her puzzles in the afternoon, and held her hand when the medications made her feel sick or tired. She no longer hesitated to call him Dad. It had slipped out one morning when he had been adjusting her blanket. She had mumbled it sleepily, and he had nearly frozen, his heart catching in his throat. He didn't say anything in the moment, afraid to scare the word away, but it echoed in his chest for the rest of the day like the warmest kind of thunder. Cassie saw it happen too, that slow, undeniable shift. She had once known a man who lived in expensive suits and schedules, whose world was built on control. But the man who now sat beside their daughter's hospital bed in wrinkled clothes and dark-circled eyes, whispering knock-knock jokes and brushing hair out of a little girl's face, he was different. Softer. Truer. She didn't say anything at first, but she watched him closely, trying to reconcile the man he used to be with the one who now reached for her hand when Chloe was taken away for follow-up scans. Emma had struggled the most with the change. She had stayed with a neighbor during the hospital nights and had grown more withdrawn, unsure of her place now that Chloe received all the attention and Adam seemed to orbit around her. One evening, when Adam came home from the hospital to check on her, she wouldn't speak to him. She sat on the floor in her room, silently braiding her doll's hair, refusing to look up. He knelt beside her and waited. After a long time, she whispered, "You're Chloe's dad now." "Not mine." Adam's heart sank. He hadn't expected her to say it, but it made perfect sense. From her eyes, he had chosen Chloe, the girl in the hospital, the one who needed him most. But Emma needed him too, just differently. He looked her in the eyes and said, "I know it feels that way. But I'm yours too. If you want me to be." She blinked at him, not convinced. "But I'm not sick. I don't need help." He took her hand gently. "That doesn't mean you don't matter. I miss just as much time with you. I want to make that up too. Not just with Chloe. With both of you." She looked at him, still unsure. "Then will you come to my school play next week? Even if Chloe still needs you?" He didn't hesitate. "I'll be there in the front row." After that, she began to soften again. She asked him to help her with a drawing, and later, she brought him a picture of a house with 4 people drawn in bright colors. She had labeled them all with careful letters, Mommy, Chloe, Emma, and Daddy. When he saw it, he didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He simply picked her up and hugged her until she giggled and said he was squeezing too hard. Back at the hospital, Chloe was gaining strength. She had color in her cheeks again and sat up more often, demanding pancakes and asking when she could go home. When the doctors finally approved her discharge, she bounced with excitement in the bed and asked if she could ride home in Adam's car, not Cassie's. He pretended to be shocked. "What? My car isn't full of stickers and cracker crumbs like your mom's." She laughed. "That's why I want to go in yours." Cassie packed their things slowly, watching Adam help Chloe into her shoes. There was something surreal about it. This man who had once vanished from her life was now folding hospital discharge papers, tucking a stuffed bear under his daughter's arm, and memorizing medication schedules like it was the most natural thing in the world. She felt something crack open inside her, something she had boarded up long ago. That night, back home, after the girls were asleep and the house had gone quiet, Cassie and Adam sat together in the living room. She was tired, her head leaning back against the couch, but her eyes were open and steady. "You really stayed," she said quietly. "I meant it," he answered. She turned her face toward him. "I thought I would have to do all of this alone. I prepared for it. But you're here." He reached for her hand, not urgently, but like someone who finally understood how fragile trust could be. "And I'm not leaving." This time, she didn't pull away. She let their fingers interlace. And when she leaned her head on his shoulder, it didn't feel like forgiveness. It felt like beginning again. The weeks that followed felt like a quiet kind of miracle. Chloe's recovery was slow but certain, each day bringing more energy, more laughter, and fewer reminders of how close things had come to the edge. The house was filled again with morning cartoons, mismatched socks, and requests for pancakes at odd hours. The chaos was constant, but so was the joy. Adam adjusted to it with a surprising kind of ease. He wasn't just a visitor anymore. He had learned the rhythm of their mornings, the language of Emma's moods, the different way Chloe smiled when she was proud versus when she was shy. He knew which books they wanted before bed and when Cassie needed a quiet look more than she needed words. There were still moments of awkwardness, little remnants of the time lost between them. Adam sometimes caught himself looking too long at family photos from before his presence, feeling the ache of absence in the space where he should have been. But then Chloe would tug on his sleeve to show him a new drawing, or Emma would slip her hand into his during a walk, and the ache would dissolve into something softer. Cassie had grown quieter too, not distant, but contemplative, like she was slowly unlearning all the ways she had taught herself not to rely on anyone. She had been a fortress for so long, and now there was someone beside her who wasn't trying to break in, but to help her carry the weight of the walls. One Sunday afternoon, the girls set up a pretend restaurant in the living room, complete with menus scribbled on notepads and mismatched dishes from the kitchen. Adam was their only customer, and he sat dutifully at their makeshift table while Chloe served invisible spaghetti and Emma tried to overcharge him for lemonade made of water. Cassie watched from the hallway, smiling, her arms crossed loosely over her chest. When he looked up and caught her eye, something passed between them that hadn't been there before, certainty. Later that evening, after the girls were in bed and the toy dishes had been returned to their shelves, Adam found Cassie standing by the kitchen window, staring out into the yard where moonlight touched the tops of the grass. He approached quietly, not wanting to break the moment. She didn't turn around when she spoke. "I never imagined we'd end up here," she said. "I spent years thinking it would just be me and them. I convinced myself that was enough. That I was enough." Adam stood beside her and looked out at the same view. "You were more than enough," he said. "You saved them. You saved yourself. You built a life for them out of nothing. I'm just trying to be worthy of it now." She turned to him then, eyes full of emotion, but not fear. "You are," she said softly. They didn't speak much more that night, but something between them had shifted again, like the final piece of something long unfinished falling into place. In the weeks that followed, Adam moved in slowly, not with bags or grand gestures, but by presence. A toothbrush left in the bathroom, a jacket hung near the door, a favorite mug that began showing up in the dishwasher. The girls noticed, of course, and when they asked if Daddy was staying forever, Cassie only smiled and looked at Adam. He answered for them. Yes. If you'll have me. Their life didn't suddenly become perfect. There were still long nights, unexpected fevers, forgotten lunches, and moments when the past tried to sneak in through the cracks. But there was also laughter, warmth, and the kind of love that doesn't shout, but anchors everything. On a quiet evening, months after Chloe's surgery, the four of them sat on the porch watching the sunset. Emma curled up in Adam's lap, Chloe beside Cassie, their hands linked. There were no big declarations, no dramatic revelations, just peace. The kind that had once seemed impossible. Adam looked at them, these three people who had once been strangers and now were his whole world, and realized that everything he had ever chased had brought him here. To this porch. To this family. To this beginning. In my opinion, the ending of this story is both deeply satisfying and emotionally earned. What began as a chance encounter rooted in regret and the pain of the unknown gradually unfolded into a journey of healing, trust, and rediscovery. Adam's transformation from a distant, driven businessman into a present, compassionate father is a reminder that it's never too late to step into the role life always meant for you. Cassie's quiet resilience and willingness to open the door again to someone who once let her down shows immense strength and grace. And the girls, through their innocence and love, become the bridge that reconnects two people who once lost each other. This isn't just a love story, it's a redemption arc wrapped in family, honesty, and second chances. And sometimes, those are the most powerful stories of all. A millionaire CEO thought he'd left his past behind, until he found his sick ex in a hospital bed with their secret triplets. Aaron Blake's life had never left room for uncertainty. He built his company from a small investment firm into one of the most respected empires in the country, driven by a belief that discipline and control could solve anything. He scheduled his days to the minute, kept emotions locked behind the same polished mask he wore for interviews and boardrooms, and never allowed himself to think about the past he had so neatly cut away. He told himself that ending things with Anna Morris was necessary. She was warm and unpredictable in ways he couldn't afford. When she told him she was pregnant, his entire body had gone cold. He hadn't shouted or blamed her. He had simply stepped back, nodded once, and walked out of her apartment without turning around. In the years since, he convinced himself it was the right choice, that he had protected them both from a life neither of them was prepared to build. But that night, as he walked into his glass-walled office high above the city, his phone began to ring. It was almost 9. No one called him at that hour except his CFO or his mother, but the number was unfamiliar. He nearly ignored it. At the last second, he swiped to answer and lifted the phone to his ear. What he heard made him sink slowly into the leather chair behind his desk. Anna's voice, hoarse and fragile in a way he'd never heard, said his name as if she wasn't sure he would respond. She sounded exhausted, every syllable careful and heavy. She told him she was sick, that she didn't know how long she had left, and that there were things he needed to see. She didn't ask for help. She didn't beg. She simply gave him the address and the room number, hospital room 314, and told him she hoped he would come. And then the line went dead. Aaron sat there for a long time, the phone still pressed to his ear, his heartbeat unsteady. He tried to tell himself he didn't owe her anything, that she had made her choice just as he had made his. But the truth was, she hadn't really made any choice at all, he had left her with none. He tried to remember the last time he had heard her laugh, the way she used to tip her head back and look at him like he was something more than the sum of his ambition. That memory was a blade against the quiet armor he had wrapped around himself for 5 years. He didn't want to stand up. He didn't want to face what waited behind that hospital door. But an hour later, he was still sitting in the dark, still listening to the echo of her voice in his head, and he knew he would go. He drove through the city without turning on the radio, every traffic light a small eternity. When he finally reached the hospital, the fluorescent lights and the antiseptic smell made him feel like a stranger in someone else's life. He moved through the corridors on autopilot, reading the room numbers as if he were reading a report, pretending his hands weren't shaking. When he reached the door to 314, he paused with his palm pressed flat against the cold metal. He tried to steady his breathing, but it was no use. He wasn't prepared for whatever waited on the other side. Nothing in his carefully constructed world had prepared him for this. He pushed the door open slowly, and what he saw stole every word from his mouth. Anna lay propped up on a thin hospital pillow, her face pale, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. But it wasn't only her. Beside her stood 3 small girls, each about 5 years old, wearing identical pale blue dresses. They held hands as they looked at him. All 3 had the same dark hair and the same clear blue eyes that stared back at him every morning in the mirror. They didn't flinch. They didn't speak. They only watched him in silent curiosity. Anna's voice was a whisper. "Aaron, meet your daughters." Aaron didn't remember walking fully into the room. One second he was frozen in the doorway, the next he was standing at the foot of the bed, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides, his mouth trying and failing to form any words at all. He felt like he was underwater, every sound muffled by the rush of his own heartbeat. The 3 girls stayed close together, each clutching the hand of the sister nearest her. They were identical in a way that made it almost painful to look at them, like staring at 3 small mirrors reflecting a truth he had spent years pretending wasn't there. He tried to focus on Anna instead, on the way her breathing looked shallow, on the slight tremor in her hand as she reached for the cup of water on the table. Her hair was pulled back in a messy knot, and he saw strands of gray threaded through the brown that hadn't been there before. She looked up at him, and he thought there might have been a flicker of something, resentment, relief, maybe just exhaustion, but it passed so quickly he couldn't be sure. He opened his mouth again, cleared his throat, and tried to speak, but nothing coherent came out. It was Anna who finally broke the silence, her voice steady even though she looked as if she hadn't slept in days. She told him their names, Lily, Sophia, and Emma. She gestured gently to each one as she spoke, and Aaron repeated the names silently in his mind like an incantation he didn't want to forget. When she said them out loud, the girls relaxed just slightly, as if the sound of their names anchored them. Lily was the one closest to the bed, her tiny hand resting protectively on Anna's blanket. Sophia stood in the middle, her chin lifted a little higher than her sister's, her blue eyes calm and unblinking. Emma, smallest by half an inch, stayed slightly behind the others, watching Aaron with cautious curiosity. Anna told him the truth in simple sentences, each one pressing deeper into his chest until he thought he might be sick. She had tried to call him once, early in the pregnancy, before she knew she was carrying 3. He hadn't answered, hadn't returned the voicemail. She hadn't tried again. She said she didn't want to beg someone to be a father, didn't want to force love into a place it clearly wasn't welcome. So she had done it alone. Every appointment, every night of sickness, every moment of fear when the doctor said triplets were high risk. She worked from home as long as she could, then relied on help from a neighbor when she was too tired to stand. There had been months when she hadn't known how she would pay rent, but she never let the girls see her cry. Aaron listened, silent, because what else could he do? Each word was another weight he deserved. He watched the girls as she spoke, saw the way they looked at Anna with absolute, unguarded love. They were her entire world. And somehow, they were part of his, even though he hadn't realized it. When she finished, she took a slow breath, as if releasing something she had carried for too long. "I didn't call you now because I wanted anything from you," she said, her voice softer. "I called because I'm sick, and they deserve to know who you are in case I can't be here. They deserve a chance to decide for themselves." His chest constricted so sharply he had to look away, focusing on the sterile linoleum floor instead of her face. He felt like everything he'd built, his career, his reputation, all the neat compartments he had used to organize his life, had been ripped open. Part of him wanted to turn around and leave, because staying meant facing every terrible choice he'd made. But then he heard a small voice, so clear in the quiet it felt almost unreal. "Are you our daddy?" It was Sophia, the one with the steady gaze. She spoke without fear, only curiosity. The other two looked up at him, waiting. He felt something crack inside, something brittle that had kept him standing all these years. He forced himself to meet her eyes, to let the truth show on his face even though it terrified him. "Yes," he said, voice raw. "I am." No one moved. Anna didn't smile or look away. She just studied him as if she were trying to decide whether this moment mattered at all. But he knew it did. He could feel it down to the marrow of his bones. In that tiny hospital room, full of antiseptic and old regrets, Aaron Blake realized he wasn't just a man who had made mistakes. He was a father. And no amount of denial would ever make that less true. The next morning Aaron sat in the same chair he had occupied all night, though he hadn't planned to stay. When the nurse had come in to check Anna's vitals, he'd stood to leave, but Lily's small hand had caught his sleeve and he'd found himself lowering back onto the stiff plastic cushion without thinking. He hadn't slept, only drifted in and out of a daze, his mind replaying every word Anna had spoken. He kept glancing at the three girls asleep on a folded hospital blanket on the floor, their heads pillowed on each other's shoulders, the way their identical faces softened in rest. Each time he looked, he felt a swell of something he didn't have a name for yet, something raw and terrible and necessary. Anna woke just after sunrise, her breathing labored but steady. She didn't look surprised to see him still there. In fact, she looked almost resigned. When she spoke, her voice was softer, like she didn't have the energy to keep it strong. She asked if he would watch them for a few hours while she slept. The words were so simple, but they landed in his chest with a weight he hadn't expected. She was trusting him, however reluctantly, and he knew better than to pretend he deserved it. He nodded, and she closed her eyes, exhausted. For a moment, the room was so quiet it felt suspended in time. As the morning unfolded, he tried to understand the shape of this new reality. He hadn't brought anything with him, no toys, no distractions, so he sat on the floor beside them when they woke, feeling awkward and out of place. But children have a way of accepting what's in front of them without needing explanations adults insist on. Lily blinked at him and asked if he could help her untangle the elastic in her hair. He had never done anything like it before. His hands fumbled, and she giggled when he accidentally snapped it against her wrist, not in pain but surprise. Sophia quietly climbed into his lap without warning, as if she had decided that if he was going to stay, he might as well be useful. Emma stayed closest to Anna, her hand resting on the edge of the bed, glancing over her shoulder every so often to check that her mother was still breathing. They asked him questions that made his throat tight. Where did he live? Did he have toys at his house? Why hadn't he come to see them before? He didn't have answers he could give, at least none he could say to little girls whose entire world was built on the certainty of their mother's love. So he told them the only honest thing he could manage, that he was sorry, that he should have been there, and that he was here now. It wasn't enough, but none of them looked away. When the nurse returned with breakfast trays, Aaron tried to help them eat. Lily insisted she could do it herself and made a point of demonstrating how to peel the lid off the yogurt cup without spilling. Sophia asked if he could read the label on her juice box because she was learning letters, and Emma held out her spoon with a hopeful expression until he understood she wanted him to feed her the oatmeal. He did it slowly, carefully, each motion unfamiliar but grounding in a way that felt almost like breathing. He wondered how many mornings like this he had missed, hundreds, maybe thousands, and the realization hollowed him out. Later that afternoon, Anna stirred and propped herself up on her elbows. For a moment she simply watched him where he sat cross-legged on the floor, Sophia curled up against his side, Lily coloring on the back of a medical form, Emma inspecting the buttons on his shirt as if they held secret meanings. He expected her to look skeptical or guarded, but instead there was something like quiet grief in her face. She knew, as he did, that no matter what came next, they couldn't go back and reclaim what they'd lost. When their eyes met, he tried to find something to say, but she spoke first. They deserve to know you, she said simply. Even if it's only for a little while. He swallowed, feeling something inside him give way. I don't want it to be only a little while. Anna's gaze held his for a long moment. She didn't agree, but she didn't argue. She just closed her eyes again, as if she was too tired to do anything else. Aaron looked down at the girls clustered around him and finally understood that whatever happened from here, nothing in his life would ever be the same. That evening Aaron drove home for the first time in nearly 24 hours. He thought returning to his penthouse apartment, with its floor-to-ceiling windows and cold marble counters, would help him clear his head. Instead, the silence was suffocating. He stood in the entryway, holding his keys in one hand, staring at the immaculate living room that had once seemed like proof of his success. Now it felt like a museum exhibit, a place designed to be looked at but never lived in. He tried to remember why he had thought any of it mattered more than the life he'd abandoned. He left the lights off as he walked through the rooms, unable to look at the carefully curated art or the expensive furniture without feeling like an imposter in his own life. He poured himself a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table, but every time he closed his eyes he saw three small faces watching him with cautious hope. He thought about the way Sophia had rested her head against his shoulder, how Emma's hand had curled around his thumb, how Lily had inspected his watch like it might hold answers. He thought about Anna's voice, stripped of any pretense, telling him that she didn't know how long she had left. His stomach clenched at the memory of how small she looked under the thin hospital blanket, how her hands shook when she tried to sip water. After an hour of sitting there, he finally stood, grabbed an old duffel bag from his closet, and started throwing clothes inside without thinking too hard about what he packed. He didn't have a plan. He only knew he couldn't go back to pretending this wasn't happening. Before he left, he stopped by the guest bedroom he'd never used and realized with a dull kind of shame that there was nothing in his home that could make a child feel welcome. No toys. No extra blankets. Not even a storybook. On the drive back to the hospital he called his assistant and left a voicemail, telling her to clear his schedule for the next week, maybe longer. He knew it would cause questions, rumors, maybe even a few raised eyebrows from the board. He didn't care. For the first time, he felt certain about what he was doing, even if he had no idea how to do it well. When he walked back into the hospital room, it was after 10. The girls were asleep again, curled up on the same blanket on the floor. Anna was awake, her face pale in the blue light of the monitors. She looked at him without surprise, just a kind of tired curiosity. I didn't think you'd come back tonight, she said quietly. He set the duffel bag down by the door. I didn't think I'd be able to stay away. Her eyes searched his face, and for the first time, there was no accusation in them, only weary acceptance. She gestured to the chair beside her bed. Sit down. You look like you haven't slept either. He did. For a few minutes neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the soft beeping of the machines and the distant murmur of nurses in the hallway. Finally Anna broke the silence, her voice so low he had to lean in to hear her. I don't know what you're expecting from this. I don't know either, he admitted. I only know I can't leave you to do it alone anymore. Her hand, frail and thin, rested on the edge of the blanket. Without thinking, he reached out and covered it with his own. Her skin was cool, her knuckles prominent. She didn't pull away. They're good girls, she whispered. They deserve stability. Not someone who shows up for a week and then disappears again. I'm not going to disappear, he said, and for the first time he believed it. I don't want to be the man I was. I'm sorry I ever thought that was enough. Her eyes filled, but she didn't let the tears fall. She nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging something neither of them could quite name. He stayed until dawn. At some point he must have fallen asleep with his head resting near her pillow. When he woke, the girls were sitting cross-legged on the floor again, watching him with wide blue eyes that were so much like his own it hurt to look at them. And for the first time in his life, Aaron didn't feel like an outsider peering in through glass. He felt like he belonged, however imperfectly, in the middle of that quiet, uncertain room. In the weeks that followed, Aaron fell into a rhythm that was nothing like any life he had ever lived. Each morning he would wake on the narrow hospital recliner with his neck aching and the unfamiliar feeling of small fingers tugging at his sleeve, urging him to get up and help with breakfast. The nurses had quickly grown used to seeing him there, always wearing the same two-day rotation of clothes, always with dark circles under his eyes but a focus that never wavered. He learned how to coax Emma to eat when she was too shy to speak above a whisper, how to distract Sophia when she grew restless and started to climb the side rails of the bed, how to find the right cartoons to keep Lily calm when Anna was too weak to talk. In those first days, Anna drifted in and out of sleep, her body fighting a relentless infection that had settled in her lungs. The doctors were cautious with their optimism, careful to temper every improvement with the reminder that her recovery could still turn at any moment. Whenever she opened her eyes and found Aaron sitting there, she would watch him with a mixture of wariness and something that almost looked like gratitude. They didn't talk much about the past. Neither of them had the energy for it. Instead they spoke in short, practical sentences, updates about medications, reminders to call the pharmacy, questions about the girls' bedtime routines. But beneath every exchange was an unspoken understanding: he was here now. And no matter what had happened before, that counted for something. The girls adapted to him with a resilience he didn't feel he deserved. They still hesitated sometimes, looking to Anna before they came to him for help, but more and more often, they reached out on their own. One evening, while he was trying to figure out how to braid Lily's hair into something that didn't look like a tangle of string, she turned around and looked up at him with wide, searching eyes. "Are you going to stay when Mama gets better?" she asked, her voice so soft he nearly pretended he hadn't heard. But he made himself meet her gaze, made himself answer honestly. "Yes," he said, "because anything less would have been another betrayal. I'm going to stay as long as you want me." She nodded, apparently satisfied, and returned to examining the coloring book in her lap. But the question haunted him long after she had fallen asleep, her small hand curled loosely around his thumb. At night, when the lights dimmed and the hospital quieted, Aaron would sit by Anna's bed and watch the slow rise and fall of her breathing. Sometimes she would wake and find him there, and for a while they would just look at each other across the dark room. It felt like standing on the edge of something neither of them knew how to cross. He wanted to tell her everything he had never said, that he was sorry, that he had been afraid, that he had spent years trying to convince himself he hadn't made the worst mistake of his life. But each time the words rose to his lips, he would see the exhaustion etched in her face and swallow them back. This wasn't the time to ask for forgiveness. This was the time to prove he had finally grown enough to be worthy of it. During the day he started to leave the hospital in short intervals, making calls and meeting with lawyers to arrange paperwork. He put his assistant in charge of transferring funds to cover every medical expense Anna might have, set up a trust for each of the girls, and made sure they would never have to wonder how they would afford school or clothes or a safe place to live. He didn't tell Anna any of this. He didn't need her gratitude. He just needed to do something, anything, to make up for all the time he had lost. On one of those afternoons, he returned to the hospital with a cardboard box of children's books under one arm. The girls crowded around him, squealing as he set the box on the floor and began to pull out titles he remembered from his own childhood. He read to them until his voice turned hoarse, each story another thread that stitched him deeper into the life he had once refused to claim. Late that night, after the girls had drifted to sleep on their makeshift bedding and Anna was resting quietly, Aaron stood by the window and looked out over the city. He thought about who he had been before this moment, a man so convinced he knew what mattered that he had turned his back on everything real. The ache in his chest was sharp but clean, like a wound that had finally begun to heal. He didn't know how long it would take to earn their trust. He didn't know if Anna would ever look at him without remembering the day he walked away. But as he turned back to the small forms asleep beside their mother, he knew that for the first time, he wasn't running anymore. He was exactly where he needed to be. By the time another month had passed, Aaron could hardly remember what his life had looked like before the hospital room became his entire world. He no longer checked his email first thing in the morning or worried about the headlines that used to matter so much. His days were measured instead in small routines that tethered him to something real. He knew which nurse brought the girls extra juice boxes, which time of day Anna was strongest, which lullabies would calm Sophia when she woke from a bad dream. There was no schedule or structure he could control. And strangely, he didn't resent it. In fact, he felt more like himself than he ever had. Anna's health improved in slow, cautious steps. She regained enough strength to sit up for longer stretches, to help the girls get dressed, to sip coffee without her hands shaking. Each time she managed something she hadn't been able to do the week before, he saw a flicker of quiet determination in her eyes that humbled him more than any business triumph ever had. She was still so thin, her color still too pale, but she was fighting, and that alone made every sacrifice worth it. Sometimes he wondered if she knew how much she was teaching him simply by existing. One morning he came in early and found her sitting up in bed with all three girls perched around her like little birds, their hair damp from the bath a nurse had given them. They were giggling at something Anna was reading aloud, and for a moment he stood in the doorway, unable to move. The sight of them together, the sound of their laughter, was so beautiful it made his throat ache. He didn't know if he deserved to step into that picture, but he knew he would spend the rest of his life trying. As the days blurred together, the girls began to rely on him without hesitation. Emma climbed into his lap with her favorite stuffed rabbit and expected him to read the same story 3 times in a row. Lily started asking him to help her practice writing her name, carefully forming each letter with her tongue poking out in concentration. Sophia, ever the most serious, sometimes just took his hand when she felt overwhelmed and held it until she calmed down. They didn't call him Daddy yet. They didn't need to. Their trust showed in other ways. In the evenings, after the girls were asleep, he and Anna started talking in low voices, no longer avoiding the past. Sometimes the conversations were tentative and brittle, full of starts and stops. Other times they were fierce, both of them too tired to pretend they weren't angry at what they'd lost. She asked him why he hadn't answered her call. He told her the truth he had been ashamed of for years, that he was terrified. That he had believed he was incapable of being the kind of man she needed. She listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable in the half-light. When she finally spoke, her voice was rough. "You were a coward." "I know," he said. "I'm still sorry." "But you're here," she whispered, closing her eyes. "And I don't know how to feel about that." "I don't expect you to know," he replied. "I just want you to let me keep showing up." After those conversations, something between them loosened. The bitterness wasn't gone, but it was no longer the only thing that defined them. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, she would wake and find him sleeping in the chair with Emma cradled in his arms, her cheek pressed to his chest. Other times, he would open his eyes and see her watching him with an expression he couldn't name. One night, as he lifted Sophia into her little cot, she blinked sleepily and mumbled, "Daddy." The word was soft, uncertain, as if she wasn't sure she was allowed to say it. He froze, his heart thudding so hard he thought it might shake the walls. When he looked over, Anna was watching, her hand covering her mouth. For a long moment no one spoke. Then he tucked the blanket around Sophia and whispered, "Yes, sweetheart," because there was no other answer. Later, when the girls were asleep, he stood at the window again, the city lights blurred by tears he didn't try to hide. He knew nothing he did could erase the day he walked away, but maybe this was the beginning of something stronger than regret. A second chance wasn't something he thought he deserved. But it was something he would never stop fighting for. By the time spring finally softened the last traces of winter, the hospital no longer felt like a place of endings to Aaron. It had become something else entirely, something almost sacred. He had spent so many hours there that he knew every creak of the hallway floor, every humming beep of the monitors, every name of every nurse on rotation. He had stopped caring whether people recognized him or whispered when he walked by. His world had shrunk to a single room where Anna and the girls were, and he felt no shame in that. Anna was well enough now to go for short walks in the hospital garden, and the first time she suggested it, the girls cheered as if she had announced a trip to the moon. Aaron helped her into the wheelchair, feeling how frail she still was despite the new steadiness in her gaze. The girls skipped ahead, their matching dresses bright splashes of blue against the gray hallway. As they made their way outside, Anna was quiet, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes watching the children with an intensity that made his chest hurt. He knew she was cataloging every moment, measuring it against all she had nearly lost. They sat under a flowering tree, petals drifting down around them like confetti. The girls plucked tiny blossoms from the grass and presented them to Anna in solemn little handfuls, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she laughed without effort. The sound startled him, it was exactly how he remembered it from years ago, when they were young and stupid and thought love would be enough to carry them through anything. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling something uncoil inside him that he hadn't known he was still holding tight. When she caught his eye, her expression softened. "You look like you're about to say something important," she said. He hesitated, because he knew nothing he could say would be enough to cover all the ways he'd failed her. But he spoke anyway, because he had learned that sometimes silence was worse than any admission. "I don't know how to explain how sorry I am," he said, his voice low. "I thought leaving was the best thing for you, for all of you. I thought I was protecting you from me." Anna was quiet for so long he wondered if she would answer at all. Then she said, very simply, "You weren't protecting me. You were protecting yourself." He nodded because there was no defense against that truth. She looked away, her gaze fixed on the girls twirling in the grass. "I won't pretend I've forgiven you," she said. "But I see you trying. And I know they see it too." For the rest of the afternoon, he stayed beside her, sometimes talking, sometimes just sitting in silence while the girls played. When Emma grew tired, she crawled into his lap without hesitation, and he held her against his chest, feeling her small heartbeat echo in the space where his own used to feel empty. After the nurses ushered them back inside, he helped Anna settle in her bed again. The girls clustered around her, chattering about the flowers and the tiny ladybug they'd discovered. As he watched them, he realized that their lives were becoming stitched together in ways he hadn't expected, ways that felt permanent, if only he could be brave enough to keep choosing them. Later that evening, when the girls were asleep and the hallway outside had gone still, Anna looked at him from her pillow, her eyes weary but clearer than he'd ever seen them. "You know they love you," she said. "Not because of what you did or didn't do before. Just because you're here now." He swallowed, feeling that familiar ache in his throat. "And you?" he asked, unable to help himself. She didn't look away. "I don't know yet," she whispered. "But I don't hate you anymore. That has to be enough for now." It was. It had to be. That night, as he sat in the dark, listening to the soft, even breathing of all four of them, Aaron felt something that was both terrifying and quietly miraculous. He wasn't just a man trying to atone for the past anymore. He was a father. He was part of their story. And no matter how much it scared him, he wasn't going to run from it ever again. When Anna was finally discharged from the hospital 2 weeks later, it didn't feel like the triumphant ending he had once imagined. It was quieter than that, and somehow more powerful because of it. The nurses wheeled her through the hall while the girls skipped alongside, their little backpacks bouncing against their shoulders. Aaron walked a step behind, carrying a small suitcase and trying to ignore the way his heart hammered in his chest. It felt like standing on the threshold of something enormous and unfinished, something that would demand more from him than any corporate empire he'd ever built. But he also knew he wouldn't trade it for anything. Anna looked healthier than she had in months, though her cheeks were still pale and her movements careful. When she paused near the entrance, she turned to the girls and told them they could go ahead with the nurse to wait by the car. For a moment it was just the two of them in the long hallway, the hush around them filled with everything they hadn't yet said. "I don't know what happens now," she admitted, her hand resting lightly on the arm of the wheelchair. "I don't either," he said honestly. "But I want to be there, whatever it is." She looked up at him, searching his face like she was trying to decide if she could believe that. He didn't look away. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said, his voice low. "But I'm not leaving again." She closed her eyes and drew in a shaky breath. "I'm too tired to make any decisions about us," she whispered. "But the girls, they deserve to have you. I'm not going to take that from them." His chest tightened. "Thank you," he said simply, because it was the only thing that felt true. The drive home was strangely peaceful. The girls sang to themselves in the back seat, trading verses of songs they had made up. Anna leaned her head against the window and didn't speak, but she didn't pull away when he reached over and took her hand. They sat like that all the way to her apartment, their joined hands resting on the center console like a small promise that nothing was truly settled but nothing was truly broken anymore either. When they arrived, he carried the suitcase upstairs and unlocked the door while Anna leaned on the railing, catching her breath. The girls burst inside first, greeting every piece of furniture as if it were an old friend. He watched them, remembering that he had never set foot in this home until today. For a moment, it struck him how much of their lives he had missed: first steps, first words, first birthdays. The ache of it was almost too much to bear. He helped Anna settle on the couch while the girls dragged out blankets and stuffed animals to make nests around her. It was chaotic and messy and perfect. When Emma crawled into his lap with her thumb in her mouth, he wrapped his arms around her and felt the first real sense of peace he had known in years. As evening fell, he cooked simple pasta while Anna rested, her eyes drifting closed as the girls recited stories and tumbled over each other with sleepy giggles. He served dinner and sat beside them at the table, listening to Sophia explain in painstaking detail how to twirl spaghetti without dropping it. The normalcy of it almost undid him. He had never known something so ordinary could feel so much like redemption. Later, after the girls were asleep in their room and the apartment had gone quiet, he stepped onto the balcony to clear his head. He felt Anna's presence behind him a moment before she spoke. "I didn't think you'd really stay," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I didn't think I'd know how," he admitted. "But I want to learn." She stood beside him, her arms crossed against the night air. "I don't know what it means for us," she said. "I don't know if I can ever trust you completely again." He nodded. "I don't expect you to. I only hope that maybe one day you'll let me try." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The city moved around them, cars passing below, lights flickering in the windows across the street, but up here, it felt like the whole world had shrunk to this small space where they were no longer strangers, not quite partners, not yet anything certain. Just two people who had survived something hard and were standing in the middle of it together. Finally, Anna turned to face him. In her tired eyes, he saw something he hadn't dared to hope for, something that looked a little like the fragile start of trust. "I don't hate you anymore," she whispered. "And maybe that's enough for today." He felt a tightness in his throat as he reached out to take her hand, careful and slow. She let him. And standing there under the soft spill of city lights, he knew he was no longer running from anything. He was standing exactly where he needed to be, with the people he was ready, finally, to love without conditions or fear. I think this ending works because it doesn't pretend everything can be magically fixed by showing up once and saying sorry. It respects that some damage leaves scars that never fully disappear. What makes it hopeful, and honestly quite moving, is that Aaron doesn't expect a perfect resolution. He doesn't pressure Anna to forgive him or rush her into some neat, romantic conclusion. Instead, he does the harder thing: he stays. He shows up again and again, knowing trust will take time. That's what gives this story weight. It's not a fairy tale redemption, it's a quiet, realistic one built on small moments, carrying a suitcase upstairs, learning to braid hair, admitting fear out loud. You feel that these characters have earned their chance at a new beginning. In the end, what moved me most was that the girls never needed explanations about the past. They simply offered love because he was there, because children have a way of seeing the person in front of them instead of the mistakes behind them. That simplicity is what saves him in the end. It's a reminder that sometimes the most meaningful transformations don't happen all at once, but in the slow, imperfect choice to stay present. And that, to me, is a beautiful message to end on.